Beautiful. Thank you. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. As you know by now, tonight is Shabbat Shira, the Shabbat of song. And this name comes from this week's Torah portion, B'Shalach, which contains the Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, that we heard in many different forms from Walt Disney to Michael Oakes tonight. And we all know the story, right? He lets the Israelites leave Egypt and travel to the promised land. Pharaoh refuses, and 10 plagues and a lot of suffering later. Pharaoh, whose heart has been hardened, relents and allows the Israelites to go. But then Pharaoh recants his decision, sends a massive army to bring the Israelite slaves back to captivity. The Sea of Reeds splits in two to allow the children of Israel to cross to freedom. Pharaoh's army drowns after God closes the sea back upon them, and Miriam and the women lead the Israelites in song, a song of rejoicing that contains these words, Michamocha ba'elim Adonai, who is like you, God, among the celestials. Now, in its most basic understanding, this story is about redemption. It is uniquely ours, telling an ancient story that is part and parcel of our Jewish DNA. But as we know, it's also universal in its application. There are countless stories of liberation from multiple cultures that compare those who are fleeing from brutal regimes and seeking asylum and safety in new lands to our story of our ancient ancestors. And when we tell and retell this story, this Shabbat on Shabbat Shira, at our Passover Seders, and every time we come together to pray and we say the words of Michamocha, we recall God's promises of liberation and freedom. And we also remember the powerful words that appear no less than 36 times in our Torah. You shall not oppress the foreigner, for you know the hearts of the foreigner, having yourselves been foreigners in the land of Egypt. And it is for this reason that several months ago we designated this Shabbat Shira, as Refugee Shabbat in conjunction with HIAS, which used to be known as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and now is known as HIAS, the organization that for over a century has been working to welcome refugees into the United States, starting with many of our ancestors who came to these shores fleeing from oppressive anti-Semitic regimes. HIAS has worked tirelessly to ensure that not only Jewish refugees were welcomed and given the tools, materials, and opportunities necessary to become part of our country, but also refugees from all over the world who have landed on our shores to escape persecution and desperate situations. Of course, when we planned this Shabbat as HIAS Refugee Shabbat, little did we know how prescient and relevant the topic of immigration would be, given this new administration and how in the past few days they have moved forcefully to identify, target, and attempt to cast away migrants from our shores with no recourse, regardless of their immigration status as refugees or asylum seekers or the lack thereof. And this past week, today, this morning, in Aurora and in Denver, we saw images of masked and heavily armed ICE and other federal agents raiding apartment buildings and complexes where large groups of immigrants live, accompanied by armored vehicles and television crews from Fox News. Many were handcuffed, loaded onto buses, and driven to as yet unidentified locations, often separating parents and children. And this campaign that can only be called one of shock and awe has put all of us on edge. Like those in our LGBTQ communities and others whose identity is being challenged, entire generations of migrants are currently terrified, as our president has made good on his promise to begin the largest campaign of deportation in our nation's history. This past week, I attended a meeting of Denver religious leaders where pastors of congregations comprised largely of immigrants shared that while 4 weeks ago their sanctuaries were filled on Sunday morning with worshipers, During the past 2 weeks, only a handful of people were on hand because of fears of being arrested. And these scenes are being replicated in factories, schools, and workplaces, and many other institutions around our city and our country. Protections that traditionally have been granted to religious institutions like ours and schools have now been decimated. Now, while there are some who applaud this action, who trace and connect the arrival of migrants to our cities with a perceived rise in criminal activity, many others are aghast at the tactics that are being employed to carry this out. But it's important that we understand that the demonization of migrants can also be seen as a necessary step by this administration in order to justify carrying out their brutal raids. Compassion is a luxury that those who wish to rid our nation of foreigners cannot afford. Now, are there criminals among those who've arrived on our shores? Of course there are. And they should be prosecuted and, if necessary, expelled. But a person's status as a refugee, whether they have applied for asylum and citizenship or not, does not make them evil. The hateful rhetoric which we are witnessing only serves to justify that which is unjustifiable. And when we combine this with the current administration's actions to cut programs that provide safety nets for the weakest and the most vulnerable in our midst, and indeed around the world, it is clear that our Jewish values of compassion for others are being sorely tested. I want to read parts of a statement that was released this past week by the Reform Movement. It's entitled, "Reform Movement's Leaders Support Immigrants and Refugees." It reads, "For decades, the Reform Movement has advocated for immigration policies that are compassionate and just, reflecting the United States' status as a nation founded and strengthened by immigrants and as a nation of laws with borders that must be secure. We now speak strongly against the policies and executive orders issued by President Trump that demonize immigrants, seek to end birthright citizenship, target immigrants for mass deportation, make synagogues newly vulnerable to immigration enforcement actions, and cut off vital funding for essential refugee resettlement work, including that which helps fund HIAS, the nation's oldest refugee resettlement agency founded by the Jewish community and now serving people of all faiths. Like most Americans, Jewish Americans are an immigrant community. Today, more than a century after the largest waves of Jewish immigration to the United States, we recall that anti-immigrant legislation passed in the 1920s discriminatorily limited legal immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe and prohibited most European Jews from finding refuge on American shores during the Nazi Holocaust. Hundreds of thousands of people who sought but could not find refuge here met their end in Hitler's gas chambers and crematoria. This terrible history reinforces the lessons of the Torah, which commands us 36 times to be mindful of the plight of the stranger, for we were strangers in Egypt. And it continues, the demonization of immigrants as criminals must stop. Mass roundups of immigrants or those perceived to be immigrants and deportation without due process must halt. Funding to refugee resettlement agencies must be restored. Efforts to eliminate the constitutional guarantee of birthright citizenship must cease. Houses of worship must again be able to fulfill their prophetic mandate without fear of ICE raids. Asylum seekers must be allowed the right to plead the case. Migrants who were previously approved to enter the U.S. must have that approval reinstated. And it is time for Congress and the Trump administration to work together to achieve immigration reform that upholds our status as a nation of immigrants, meets the needs of businesses and employers, and ensures the nation's security and future well-being. It is signed by the leadership of the Union for Reform Judaism and all of its affiliates. Now, friends, when we read Shirat Hayam, when we read the Song of the Sea, our task is to put ourselves into the places of those who are fleeing from slavery into a new life. We say every year on Passover, in every generation, we must see ourselves as though we ourselves went forth out of Egypt. We tell our story, but we do more than that. We experience the fear and the joy, the fear of slavery and the joy of redemption. The longing to be free, to be able to live without fear or persecution, is a universal desire of all people created in the image of God. We are here today, many of us, because our grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents risked everything and went on a perilous journey for our sake. This is our birthright. And similarly, our ancient ancestors in Egypt walked on dry land as the waters piled high into the sky next to them. The seabed on which they traversed was unstable, was muddy. The waters threatened to fall down on them as they walked between these two walls. Their terror could be felt in the exultation of their song as they stood on the shores and watched the waters recede and their enemies perish. One thing we don't always read is the end of Bishalach. We read the Song of the Sea, but there's a very important line in the end. It concludes with the introduction of a new enemy to the Jewish people. Pharaoh has been replaced by Amalek, the one who attacked the Israelites from behind, killing the women and children. And there's a very confusing commandment, one of the most confusing commandments in the Torah. It says, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek, which literally means, remember what Amalek did to you, how he cut down the weakest from behind, but then it follows with this commandment. Blot out the memory of Amalek, do not forget. Blot out the memory of Amalek, do not forget. We're supposed to erase Amalek's memory and not forget. How do we do both? And it's in that tension that the Kabbalists came up with another interpretation. You see, the Hebrew words, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek, can be also translated as taking the word lecha, which means to you, remember what Amalek did to you, and turning it around and translating it as meaning within you. Remember what Amalek did within you. It's like when we say lech lecha, go forth, go within yourself and learn. And so in this light, instead of reading remember what Amalek did to you, we read remember what Amalek did within you. And this calls us to remember that all of us have some Amalek within us. We all have the potential to strike out against the good and the fragile in our world. And as our nation begins this new chapter, we all must be vigilant to uphold our greatest values, not of Amalek, but of compassion, of empathy, and of understanding. And if we do not, we run the risk of unleashing yet another Amalek, not against us, but within us. This is not who we are as Jews. This is not who we must be or should be as a nation. And so as we celebrate our freedom, our task on this Shabbat Shira is to remember just how precious freedom is to all God's people. Shabbat Shalom.